Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier in this panel, one of my colleagues said that these transmission lines and renewable would be competitive, that cost would come down. But Mr. Clark, that would only be, that statement can only be made in the context of the massive amount of federal subsidies that go to solar and wind. I've got a report here, it came out in April of this year. It shows the subsidies for wind at almost $34 billion and the subsidies for solar at almost $27 billion. That's almost 3 times the combined subsidies for expensing of exploration costs for oil and natural gas and for the depletion allowance for oil and natural gas. Given that the taxpayers are basically having to foot the bill for this, that's not exactly a reduction in cost, is it?
So, Congressman, I mean, there have been a number of studies recently that would indicate that even without the subsidies, a lot of renewables are becoming competitive, which would seem to indicate that perhaps you don't need the subsidies to continue to promote the renewables. I think originally those subsidies were intended as sort of a jump start to that industry, and there was an expectation that most of those would be phased out, but they have been extended several times. They can have distortive impacts on the market. It's something that Congress will want to be aware of. But as I indicated earlier, utilities will build resources for different reasons. Renewables can be a very competitive option when it comes to
Let
things like...
me just point out, having worked for a couple of engineering companies, that a lot of the cost of this will be in the form of stranded costs, and it's going to be enormously expensive to completely replace the power grid. I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars to have one uniform grid. And that cost is going to be borne either by the taxpayer or the ratepayer or both. It'll be borne by the people who are doing manufacturing or operating businesses. As I point out to people, businesses don't pay regulatory costs. They don't pay taxes. Consumers do. So any way you look at it, in the long term, this is going to be extremely expensive, as was the current grid, because they're still paying for the stranded costs. I also want to raise another issue that several of my colleagues have raised that I'm not sure that my Democrat colleagues have adequately addressed, and that is the issue of the power of eminent domain. Section 216 of the Federal Power Act authorizes the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to issue a federal permit that preempts state limits and grant permit holders eminent domain authority. Is it possible that the permit holder could be a private company?
Oh, yes, Congressman.
So we would be granting a private company eminent domain authority over property owners.
That's correct. It would greatly expand what's now an unused federal backstop authority into what, in my testimony, I call really just federal siting authority.
Well, that is very disturbing to me. And I pointed out on the earlier panel the number of states that have fought the expansion of these transmission lines over state property, over private property. One of my colleagues on the Republican side quoted the chairman of this committee, Frank Pallone, and his arguments against a pipeline being forced, a construction of pipeline being forced on his home state of New Jersey. I respect the chairman's position on that. He's absolutely right to defend his state's property rights, both the state property and the private property owners. You know, I find it striking that the federal government has declared certain species endangered, like the lesser prairie chicken that they're about to put on the endangered species list that will impact what's going on in the Permian Basin. But, and I don't want to make light of this, but it's almost as though they give more power, more rights to the lesser prairie chicken than they do a homeowner or a farm owner, a ranch owner, or a municipality. And that's disturbing to me. So I hope that as we go forward, Mr. Gramlich and others on this panel, that you realize that you're trampling on constitutional rights. And there's nothing in our Constitution that I think people hold as dear as they do their right to private property. I yield back.